So let's talk about when to change jobs. So I know this is something that you've recently gone through, and I guess I've relatively recently gone through it at the beginning of this year. So yeah, it seems like an interesting topic, a relevant topic. I'll put you on the spot first. So what are some of the things that come to your mind or that you really value or that you look at when making the decision to either change jobs or to just tough out the situation that you're in?
I categorize it in two separate buckets. One that where the reasons are more personally inclined, and the other where the reasons are based on company decisions, directions, so on and so forth. So the easier ones, things that are more subjective, would be when the work is no longer challenging or stimulating. When you drag yourself to your desk every morning and everything seems like a chore. Another thing is you feel like you've learned all that you can from your peers. That's a really good indicator that maybe you've hit your ceiling at either that position or that company, and it's probably a good time to look for something that is a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, those are some good ones. Let me throw out one of the common ones that I've kind of heard before. What about changing jobs for basically more money?
That could be a really good driving factor depending on your situation. I don't think it should be like the main factor. It all depends on your situation. If that's what you're looking for and you feel like you bring that much value to the company, then sure.
It's interesting that you rate it in priorities and not necessarily the highest priority. Like, where would you personally rank it, or what kind of things do you put above your salary?
What is it that I want to work on and what I want to learn? And what area in the technology I want to grow into or perfect?
That's a great example there. So I guess the opposite side of this coin would be the mercenary mentality. So if someone were to just offer you more to poach you away from what you're doing, to maybe not do something where, let's say, you're not going to have maybe as many growth opportunities, or you're not going to have like that mentor to learn from. Actually, here's a great scenario for that maybe. What if someone were trying to poach you away for like a startup and you were going to be kind of like a solo engineer or like the founding engineer in that startup? Founding engineer might be the wrong term, because we'll say maybe you don't either have an ownership interest in it, or you're going to get it eventually, but you don't get it up front. In that kind of situation, you're not necessarily going to have somebody to learn from. Maybe you're growing technology wise, maybe you're not. How do you balance that type of decision out?
That scenario is more like a playground for that individual because they don't have any guardrails. They don't have anyone to validate any of their output. Everything around the company hinges on the success of that individual. Depending on the individual, I don't know, that might go perfectly right or perfectly wrong. If it's good money, it's good money. But yeah, it all really depends on the situation and environment that you want to work in. If you want to be a solo developer in your own little cubicle or room and get paid for it, that works for some people. It's definitely not something that I would prefer. I love collaborating with other engineers. I love understanding and figuring out how they think and what their process are, because it just might mean that they're doing something a little bit better. It gives me the opportunity to adopt something new into my own process and craft.
Yeah, totally. Are there places where you would draw the line for not taking a certain amount of money to do something? Or basically like nobody could pay you enough to do some type of job?
Yeah, if it's like the naughty stuff or I don't know, something that goes completely against my values and what I believe in. Aside from that, if it aligns with my ethos, my values, and my mission, then yeah, sign me up.
You hit a good one there with values, because that's definitely something that I look for. I guess there's two parts to this question then. What type of values do you look for? And then how do your values rank?
How I would qualify a company in general, right? During like interviews.
Yep.
I would say that's at the top, because if the values of the company that I'm interested align with my own values, then everything should theoretically be good. And what I look for is quality in work and integrity, flexibility in what we do, sustainability, and transparency. I know I just blurted out a lot of classifiers there. It all comes down to your core values, and does this company X align with that? And they could. The company could align perfectly with those values during your interview process, but guess what? Companies grow. And that is a very common catalyst for things to go downhill. Growth is good. However, from a financial perspective, it's great. But more importantly, it means that you can reach more clients or customers and help them solve challenging problems. However, if not managed correctly, the people layer of that company can grow towards directions that the company didn't originally intend, causing shift in culture, vision, and overall trajectory. That's like the tipping point. And sometimes it's too late to realize that a company has gotten there, but that's like a really good time to reflect on and figure out if you want to continue with this path forward or fork and go somewhere else.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know we both have been through that one before. Let me change some of that wording around there, where when you said go downhill, let me put it into context where sometimes I guess a company could have more or less objectively go downhill if you see them starting to do like shady things, for example. But to broaden this concept, I'll say instead of going downhill, I'll say drift out of alignment.
That would perfectly describe it, yes.
Yeah, so they are no longer going down the track that you're going down. And if you stick with them, basically they're not going to help you accomplish your goals. And you basically like stop sharing mutual goals at that point, or have very few mutual goals in common at that point. Yeah, if I rephrase it that way, it might land a little softer there.
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant.
I think there's a little bit of a difference there, because I do look at alignment as like that trajectory. The company is also not necessarily the only one growing at that time, because you mentioned being able to work at a place where you can learn from people and that kind of stuff. And that's obviously one of the things that's important to me as well. That means you as an individual are growing as well. So you're on one growth track. The company you're working for is on another growth track. Hopefully they match up the same for as long as possible, but everything changes and that's not always going to be the case. So yeah, I would echo what you say. And alignment is one of the big things that I look for. And like you said, values are also one of the other very important things I look for. Both of those definitely being above compensation. Don't get me wrong, compensation is important, but not the most important.
Agreed. And just to clarify, it doesn't mean that it always has to happen this way. There's always a negative falling. It's just that we as engineers need to spot these flags as they're coming up and reflect on it and see if this is fit for me.
You know, another good point on alignment that's coming to my mind, it happened earlier on in my life rather than later on. And I see other people do this as well. And that's blaming the company or blaming somebody else for that drift in alignment and not realizing it's that, and labeling it as something else of like, basically they're a terrible person, they're a terrible company. When most of the time they actually aren't. Most of the time it's just you have two different objectives and they don't line up, and they just like, you don't share your viewpoints anymore. Every so often you can have that person or company that does actually turn evil, but I think that's a lot more rare. Most of the time it's probably just you're drifting in two different directions. And if you just objectively recognize that, it can take a little bit of that emotional edge off of the situation. So rather than acting irrationally about that and being like, screw these people, I'm going to leave, whatever, you don't have to harbor resentment or put yourself under any more emotional stress or anything like that. And you can just approach it a lot more rationally and calmly and more objectively.
Agreed. It's all business at the end of the day. And we do have to realize that to a certain degree. Most of the time, like you said, it's not, the things aren't being done out of malice. It's their numbers, and the company's doing their best to keep the business afloat, do things that might seem that they're working, but the equation at the end, what is after that equal sign? Does it actually continue to align with where you want to be, your values, etc.? And at that point, it might not be the case. So yeah, like you said, it's not something where we should either feel bad or blame someone or try to find someone to blame, because that's not healthy in general. It's just natural growth, and people grow in different directions, right?
Yep. So when you listed off some of your values, that kind of ties back into something. Some of the engineers that I've bumped into will go to a place for the tech stack they're working on or the technical challenge or the technical aspect of it without necessarily knowing or understanding what the product is that they're working on. It's like, oh, I want to jump into this because I wanted to work with X technology or I wanted to work on this type of thing. But they don't actually fully understand what the business does. Do you have any thoughts on that, first of all?
So I probably wouldn't classify that strictly under values. I would probably add that into its own bucket and maybe call it like mission and motivation of business.
Let me add the twist to this that will hit home with you. I'll tempt you on this one so that it's going to be a really hard choice for you and you can see the dilemma here. So let's say that this company is building out a new product and it's Rust based, and that's the language you get to work in. And I love that you're laughing because I know your kryptonite. So they're using Rust. It's going to be the ideal tech stack for you, but they're using it to build a kitten blender.
Gotta blend that kitten.
That's what I thought you would say. So,
No.
And just to use something a little ridiculous, but as like, what if the company's actually building a product that's either socially irresponsible or not a good product? Just to tie that back, we'll say that might be able to relate to, like some fintech offerings or other things like that. I think anyway, I won't go into the other, there's a handful of industries that actually applies to. I'll just use the ridiculous example for the case of the podcast, but that's something that might be important to think about.
For myself personally, that's a clear red flag. I would not touch that with a 10-foot pole. And that's because it doesn't align with what I believe in. And more importantly, the value that I want to bring to the world.
How are you making your decisions or how are you filtering out companies? Because you're obviously going beyond the tech. How do you decide if you have that opportunity to go in and work with that new technology that you really want to use versus doing the research on what the company that you're working for is actually doing?
I would probably do the research and not care about the technology. A good example is if there's fantastic company Z working on product X that I just love and want to work on. But guess what? It's maybe just a pure front end, very simple React application with a Node.js backend. I wouldn't care. It's all syntax sugar at the end of the day. But if it's a product that I want to be a part of and help shape, then that has more of a driving factor than actually working on a technology stack that I want to work in. Why? Because I can work on that technology stack on my own time. And guess what? I do. After hours, I keep working on side projects, tinkering with Raspberry Pi, LoRa radios, whatever. If I like it, I work with it.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Always having side projects and other stuff going on is definitely a good thing and can also help scratch some of those technical itches that you have. So let's take that to another example, because I think culture is one of the values that you brought up as well. How do you approach the situation if you're in a spot where your boss is a jerk?
That's a good one. I would say that it's not a complete deal breaker because coming from a consultancy background, we've often worked with clients that are a bit difficult, but we have to learn to work with them. And I think the same thing applies here. Even though the boss might be a jerk, we could learn how he works so that we can work effectively with him. And it comes down to interfaces. What is his interface and how we can poke those buttons and gears so that we actually communicate, align, and get work done. We're not always going to be in the same room. We're not always going to be in constant communication. So I don't think it should be a big motivational factor that decides if you want to stay in that company or not.
Totally. And I obviously bring that one up because I see folks online all the time and sometimes hear people complaining through the grapevine, of those types of things. And I think it's like what you said. And I like how you kind of tie it back to an engineering analogy. It's really about finding the proper interface, especially like you and I have done consulting for so long at this point that I would say having a bad boss, actually, let me not use the term bad boss. Let me go back to using the term jerk, because there's other ways that you could have a bad boss that would be a disservice to you where you should probably leave. And I think those tie back into things like a growth path. So I'll use the term jerk, implying that there's communication friction there between the two of you, but that most of the other stuff is fine or not relevant. And I can take this not just a boss as well. You could say like toxic teammates or, whatever. And I agree with you on that one. That's a good time to tough that out and just build up your own personal skills and tolerance against that and learn how to work with those people, how to tough out an environment like that. Because like what we've done in consulting, to put it bluntly, you're going to get bad clients every now and then. I see it as your obligation as a consultant to be the one who can work a client through those situations. Like it's still your responsibility to get the project done. That situation internally can actually be a really good set of skills to build up just to be better at your soft skills, because it's not necessarily all about your tech skills.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that can be one of those really good situations. And if you build those up enough, you might actually be able to turn those people around from being difficult to work with or appearing like jerks to people you can tolerate. Or the other thing that I guess we haven't touched on is maybe someone just seems like that because you haven't understood them well enough yet. One of the great things that Nate did one of our podcasts on with his advice of sometimes the person that seems like a demon isn't actually like that. Most of the time they aren't. And you might just need to get to know them a little better. Maybe those people that you think are jerks or that you really don't like working with, maybe you just need to spend more time with them. Maybe you just need to get to know them better. And maybe that's one of the things that turns that relationship around rather than pulling the ripcord and leaving the company, because maybe you actually still have more to contribute there. Maybe you had more to grow there. And
Yeah, I agree. And sometimes it's a natural instinct that they just fall into. And maybe it's a product of anxiety and stress. Like these are folk in leadership leading either a product or an entire company. And maybe it's not out of malice. There's too much on my plate, on my shoulders. And anything that anyone says will trigger me. There's definitely techniques that one can use to diffuse or walk around that safely, just navigate those waters well. But it's all about, like you said, figuring out how to communicate effectively.
so I've got another scenario as well to switch gears a little bit on. What happens if you're working for a CEO who is not going to get you where you need to go? And like they're not going to get the company where it needs to go.
That's a perfect time to fire the CEO.
Thanks for stealing my phrase. I was really trying to lead into that one. Yeah, that's exactly it. I've been in this situation, you've been in this situation, and I've seen other folks in that situation where they'll typically get pretty frustrated. Don't get me wrong. Frustration in that situation is always a given. I guess it's how you manage that frustration. I've seen people be pretty outwardly frustrated in that situation, and that's where it start causing an issue. That's one of those cases though where it's about recognizing, kind of back to alignment, that there's an alignment issue there, and not just an alignment between you and the company, but there's likely an alignment problem with where that leader is actually taking the rest of the company and how they're going to get it there. So that's one of those cases where I know a lot of people can, and I definitely have felt this way many times before. You can kind of feel like I don't have control over this situation and I'm just going to get stuck being along for the ride on a company that is just not only going in the wrong direction now, but is also not doing a good job at executing in that direction. So now you don't just have these clear two pathways of misalignment. It's like there's all these little branches of misalignment between all sorts of stuff and all sorts of people, and it's just a bit of a mess. That's one of the reasons why I kind of go back to the phrase, sometimes it's time to fire your CEO, because especially on the employee side, you can kind of get that feeling of like, oh man, the company is just going to like get rid of me when they don't need me anymore. And I don't have any control of how to do anything about this. I'm not necessarily in leadership or maybe high enough up the leadership chain to like have the ear of executive leadership to get them to do something about it. That's one of those tools of being able to take your power back and remembering how much power that you actually do have as an individual. You are in charge of your own destiny. And this is one of the tools for that. So when you're on a bus that is not being driven in the right direction and it's going to get you in trouble or it's going to crash, and you don't want to be there for the crash, you have the ability to replace your company's leadership. Unfortunately, it means replacing the entire company you work for, but you do have that ability. So that's one way of looking at it. If your current executive leader is not capable of getting you to where not only you need to go, but where the company needs to go, then that's a really good time to look for a company with good leadership. And that's the power that you have as an individual to go out and replace the leadership team that you work for.
And in that particular scenario, there is a trap that I've seen happen, and that is the wishful thinking that maybe you can make a difference.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
If higher leadership is definitely stuck in their ways and there's no way of moving that rock, there is nothing that you can do to change the trajectory there. You might make it better for your surrounding peers, your project, but that's the best that you'll be able to do.
That's such a good point. So do you have any litmus tests for how you go about that, or how you know you can either make a change or you can't make a change?
I don't know how to answer that yet. I've failed many times at making change in leadership and in process mainly. So I can't say that something I've done has influenced greatly in order for that change to actually occur. It's not so much about what I wanted to change, is that I couldn't get higher leadership to buy into that. And it comes down to individuals being too stuck in their ways and not seeing the little value that this little change can do. And it's not really about that small change. It's about the process of change and the rate of change. A lot of what I propose usually is, let's make incremental changes to a process and keep iterating until that process is perfected. We don't have to throw away the entire mantle. We're just tweaking things every week or so and seeing if that improves things. And I feel like that process is very easy to implement and ingest, but for some reason, even something as simplistic as that is incredibly difficult to adopt in larger companies.
I would definitely +1 the iterative approach. That is a good strategy for at least making the changes more palatable and more bite-sized, especially to that level, less threatening to folks. If there's politics involved or, strong feelings involved about the way things are. But yeah, on that theme, I'll say my failure rate is by far higher than my win rate on that one as well. So I don't have the magic formula for how to do that either. But I think you're right. It's about having the right conversations, or at least trying to have those conversations. I think that's kind of the big thing. It's the attempt on your end as an individual contributor or as somebody who's in lower level leadership, like line level leadership, to try to have the conversations and see if you can make anything stick. If there's progress there, then hopefully that's a good sign and you can be patient and just wait for things to play out their course. If you don't have that receptiveness, then the ideas may never stick and it may be time to go somewhere else. So we've covered a lot here. Anything else that you want to leave us with?
No, I don't think so.
Well, this was a great conversation, and we'll catch you all next time on the next episode of Full Stack Engineering.